All right, so when you're finding your correlation coefficient by hand, okay, you want to follow this formula here, where R equals S sub xy divided by S sub x times S sub y. What are those things? Here are the respective formulas that you need. S sub x is the sum of x times y, so your x's times your y's, add them all up together, minus the sum of your x's times the sum of your y's divided by n. What's n? Number of terms you have, number of pieces of data that you have. So in the example that we're going to use, which is the one about the spoons of plant food, there's 4 pieces of data. S sub x is the square root of the sum of your x's squared minus the sum of your x's, that quantity squared, divided by n. And then your y's, similar except with the y's, as you guys can see there. We'll work this out, show all of our steps so you guys can see how to do it by hand. It's also good to know, just in case they give you S sub xy, S sub x, and S sub y, and they ask you what is the correlation coefficient. You need to know the formula. Okay? So, what are my x's? 1, 2,
3, 4,
Now I do need the sum of my x's, so what's that total? 10. What are my y's?
2, 3, 8, 7,
What's the sum?
20.
Okay, I need both of those for my formula. Now I need to do a little bit of math. What's x times y? What's 1 times 2? 2 times 3?
6,
3 times 8?
24,
And 4 times 7?
28,
I need the sum of this as well, which is,
60,
now I need to square my x's. What's 1 squared?
1,
2 squared?
4,
3 squared?
9,
4 squared?
16,
I need that sum as well. If you put it into a nice little table, it makes things so much easier. What is the sum of all those?
30,
And lastly, my y squares. What's 2 squared?
4,
3 squared?
9,
8 squared?
64,
7 squared?
49,
Almost gave you the answer there. What's the sum?
126.
Okay, so the totals represents the sum of these respective columns. So when we go to figure out exactly what our correlation coefficient is by hand, we're going to use those values. Oops, wrong way. So let's plug it in. What's the sum of x times y? 60. You're going to subtract that from the sum of your x's. What was the sum of your x's?
10,
You multiply that by the sum of your y's,
20,
and you divide it by n, which is 4. So that is 60 minus 200 over 4, which is 10. So our numerator is 10. So good? So far, so good? Okay. Now, S sub x, the first part of our denominator, says the square root of the sum of your x squares. What was the sum of x squared? 30. You're going to subtract that from your x's, the sum of your x's. What was the sum of just my x's? 10. You're going to square that and divide it by 4. What's 10 squared?
100,
What's 100 divided by 4?
25,
And what's 30 minus 25? So the first part of my denominator is the square root of 5. Okay? Now the last part of my denominator, I need the sum of my y squares, which is 126. I need the sum of just my y's, which was 20. I'm going to square that number and divide it by 4. What's 20 squared? What's 400 divided by 4? So you have 126 minus 100, which is the square root of, that's the other part of your denominator. So now at this point, we are going to have to use our calculator because I don't know what the square root of 5 is or 26. I have an idea, but I want to make sure I get it as close as possible. Okay? So I'm going to do 10 divided by, in parentheses, the square root of 5 times the square root of 26. Because I want to make sure that my calculator knows I want to multiply those two square roots together, and then that's the denominator that 10 is being divided by. So we get 0.877, which is the same thing we got when we did it using our calculator. Okay? We got 0.877. Remember, doing it with our calculator, you go to stat, you go to edit, and all your data is in there. Remember, you type in your x's into L1, your y's into L2. You go to stat, over to calc, option 4, and if your calculator looks like mine, then you want to make sure that your X list is L1, your Y list is L2, but make sure there's nothing in your frequency list. Make sure there's nothing in your frequency list. So if there's an L2 sitting there, just clear it out. How do I store it? That's when I go through the whole bars, Y bars, 1, 1. Okay? When we hit calculate, that's exactly what we got, 0.877. Okay, so we can do it by hand, get the same number, do it by the calculator, and get the same number.